Match each equation to the correct graph. Let's first take a look at the notes. When we have an equation of a hyperbola in standard form, as shown here, if we have the x part minus the y part, the hyperbola has a horizontal transverse axis. Recall the transverse axis is the axis in which the endpoints are the vertices of the hyperbola. The hyperbola on the left below has a horizontal transverse axis. Notice the center is the midpoint of the transverse axis, and from the equation, the center is the point h comma k. If the equation is in the form of the y part minus the x part, then the hyperbola has a vertical transverse axis, like the hyperbola on the right. Again, the endpoints are the vertices. The center is the midpoint of the transverse axis, which is also the point h comma k. This information alone should be enough for us to match the equation to the correct graph. Let's first analyze the three graphs. It may be hard to read. This is hyperbola A, this is hyperbola B, and this is hyperbola C. Notice hyperbola A has a vertical transverse axis, and the center, which again is the midpoint of the transverse axis, in this case is the point 2, 1. Hyperbola B also has a vertical transverse axis, but now the center is 2, -1. And hyperbola C has a horizontal transverse axis, and the center is the point 2, 1. And now let's take a look at our equations. We need to be careful about this first equation. Notice it's not in standard form. We need the right side to be equal to 1. So we'll begin by subtracting the square of x minus 2 divided by 4 on both sides of the equation. In standard form, we have the square of y plus 1 divided by 9 minus the square of x minus 2 divided by 4 equals 1. Now the equation is in standard form. Because we have the y part minus the x part, we know we have a vertical transverse axis, which means the correct graph must be A or B. Let's determine the center from the equation. In both forms of the equation, the center is h, comma k. Notice we always find the value of h from the x part. We always find the value of k from the y part. Looking at the x part, notice we have x minus 2, which indicates h is positive 2. And now looking at the y part, because we have y plus 1, k is negative 1. To find the value of k, notice we need the form of y minus k, and y plus 1 is equivalent to y minus negative 1, which is why k is negative 1. So the correct graph must have a vertical transverse axis and a center of 2, -1, which matches graph B. The first equation matches with graph B. Now the next two equations are in standard form. Looking at the second equation, because we have the x part minus the y part, we now know we have a horizontal transverse axis, and therefore the correct graph must be graph C. But let's also determine the center. Looking at the x part, we have x minus 2, and therefore h is positive 2. Looking at the y part, we have y minus 1, and therefore k is positive 1. The center is 2, 1, and we have a horizontal transverse axis, which does match graph C. The correct graph for equation 2 is C, which of course means the correct graph for the third equation is graph A. But let's go ahead and just verify this. We have the y part minus the x part, which indicates we have a vertical transverse axis, which is true for hyperbola A. And now determining the center, because we have x minus 2, h is positive 2. Because we have y minus 1, k is positive 1. Notice hyperbola A has a vertical transverse axis and a center of 2, 1. The third equation matches with graph A. I hope you found this helpful.